Welcome to the Social Mobility Talks podcast, brought to you by the Social Mobility Commission. The SMC publishes research on social mobility, and we use this to provide advice to government. We also work to promote social mobility ourselves by collaborating with and challenging employers, professionals, universities, schools, families, and other organisations to play their part. Today's episode is hosted by me, Rob Wilson, Deputy Chair of the Social Mobility Commission, and I'm delighted to welcome Sir David Bell to the podcast. Sir David was previously Permanent Secretary at the Department of Education and a former Chief Inspector of Ofsted. He's now Vice-Chancellor of the University of Sunderland. Welcome, David, to today's podcast.
Thanks very much, Rob.
Now, I'm really delighted to be speaking to you today for a number of reasons, partly because we have a common history, but early years is such an important topic and a real focus for us at the SMC. It's really part of our nurturing talent pillar in the State of the Nation action plan that we have. Now, I'm really interested today in discussing what's best for the child in this debate that seems to be going on, particularly in terms of cognitive development and emotional well-being. And there seems to be a lot of developing focus and indeed evidence of these outcomes. So I'm really keen to hear your views today about these things. So you've obviously had a huge wealth of experience in the education sector, from primary schools to mainstream schools, from local government to central government, and also a variety of boards and committees. And this crucial experience that you've got is obviously the reason why the Labour Party have asked you to conduct their review about child care. So I'd really like to begin by you giving us a quick outline of what that review is and what it's going to include and some of the areas that you're going to cover.
The review is based on one of the Labour Party's proposed missions for government, and this is the Opportunity Mission, and specifically the mission to remove barriers to opportunity. And in that context, of course, early years and childcare is crucial. So the review is looking at a number of aspects of early education and childcare, for example, expansion, where that might be possible, the quality of provision in early years and childcare, as well as the future direction of early years and childcare. What do we really want to achieve as a nation when it comes to the best start in life for our children?
Those are all really laudable aims, but let's look at what the government is proposing at the moment and see how those two things tally. Because at the moment, the government is obviously proposing quite big changes, some of which kick in quite soon, but will end after a period of time with 30 hours of childcare for children over the age of 9 months, which obviously is a very young age to start. I mean, firstly, I'd be interested to know what your views are on the government's proposed plans and what impact you think that those plans might have on social mobility.
I think most people who are interested in early education and childcare, Rob, were pleased to see that kind of commitment being made by government. I think there's a question, of course, about how that's going to be achieved, and we might come back to that later on. But I think the principle of providing greater choice to parents and better opportunities for children is a laudable one, and which I think most people would agree upon. In terms of social mobility, I think there's a dimension of this related to the parent or parents, and there's a dimension of this related to the child. So for parents, of course, expanding choice of what they are able to do in terms of employment, perhaps getting back into the workplace after a period of time. That's important, and that's important for them as individuals, but it's also important for the productivity of the nation. As far as children are concerned, and here we are into an important point, where there is high quality childcare and education, there are opportunities for children as well. So I think you can see, not just in this recent government policy, but in the expansion of early years and childcare that we've seen in recent decades, a strong underpinning theme related to social mobility.
So As I said at the start, I'm particularly interested in how we get the best outcomes for children. There are all sorts of other benefits to childcare, but particularly in terms of cognitive development and well-being development of the child. The government states that the aims of this expansion is to support more parents back into work, and I think you've sort of suggested that that's also something the Labour Party would quite like to do in government, and certainly that is, as I say, what the government wants to do. But I'm interested in your views as to whether this is really the right focus, the right driving force for policy making. I mean, how do we see the child fitting into this picture where, from 9 months old, they're 30 hours in childcare?
I think there's often a false dichotomy presented. So it's either about the employment demands of a new policy, so to get more parents back into work, or it's about the best interests of the child. And I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. Now, there are ways in which we can ensure better quality for children, which again we can discuss in more detail. But I think it's entirely reasonable for government to want to enhance opportunities for parents, again back to productivity and the best interest of the economic well-being of the nation. That's absolutely central and important. But I think you can, alongside that, as we have seen, introduce and develop ways of childcare and education that are in the best interests of the child. Now, some commentators would argue, some academics would argue that what you're doing is you're loading a lot onto a single policy. So you're wanting a single policy, the expansion of childcare, to do this myriad of things. And I get that argument. So it's necessary, I think, for social mobility purposes to have that expansion of opportunity, but it's not a sufficient condition when it comes to the quality for children. And I think the point about, are we now going to demand that every child is in a childcare setting from 9 months? I don't think there's anyone in the political arena, Rob, who seriously suggests that. I think this is about expanding choice for parents if they want to go back to work and they don't feel as if somehow they're going to be inhibited from doing so. At the same time, if children are spending more hours in childcare or early education settings, we want that to be of the highest quality. And I think there's political consensus on that point.
I'll come back to the choice thing later in the podcast, but I'd just like to drill into a bit more about the benefits to the child. So the research that we've done as the SMC has shown that early parent-child interaction plays a really important role in helping young children to learn words, to start to communicate, and to improve future outcomes, basically. Now, the political consensus, as you were referring to just then, seems to be very much in favour of very young children and toddlers spending less time with their families and more time being educated by the state, effectively. Now, is that really a good idea to be doing that?
I don't think that is a political consensus, Rob. I think the expansion of opportunity for children in childcare or early education is precisely that. It's an opportunity, it's not a requirement. And I think there is great political consensus that relationship, the relationships you've described between children and their parents, is absolutely crucial. Whether parents are at home with their children or whether, which is more often the case, Rob, parents are mixing and matching the care that they are providing for their children with opportunities for their children to go into a setting like a childcare nursery or a nursery class in school. So I don't think there's any real sense of direction when you've got to send your child into that. And I would be completely opposed to that, as I think most people would be. We do know, of course, that poverty is an inhibitor because parents who are finding it hard to make ends meet find it harder, naturally, just to spend time and to give attention to their children. So this is where it's a multifaceted approach, isn't it, to the best interests of the parent and the child, because children, we know, won't thrive as well as they might if they are in circumstances of poverty or extreme poverty.
So I'll come back to some of those things, but let's just deal with some of the issues that this expansion might have. I mean, there have been in the sector quite a few concerns expressed about this new entitlement and how it's going to work, and whether there's capacity in nurseries and the early years set up to do these things. What do you see as the key barriers to the delivery of the new system, and how do you think they can be addressed?
I think a lot of people who are working in the system at the moment are concerned about capacity. In other words, will there be enough places to meet the government's commitments? And I think that feels like a real problem at the moment. This is a mixed sector where we have state provision, we have nursery provision provided by the private sector, and we also have it provided by the voluntary sector. Now, part of the argument is that the market will adapt, that provision will emerge, and I think some of that will happen. But I think there are very real concerns being expressed at the moment that we can't ignore. Some of that, I think, is also related to the availability of the workforce. And I think there's quite a lot of evidence at the moment that the private sector nurseries in particular are finding it difficult to recruit and to retain staff. So if you've got this combination of lack of availability of places alongside a lack of availability of staff, then you have something of a perfect storm brewing there. There's probably a wider question about, well, did the government not anticipate that when it was making this kind of commitment? And I think that is a legitimate question to ask. And I think one of the problems that incoming government might face is that it's got a set of commitments that the previous government has made, and it may not be on track to meet those commitments should it continue to choose to do so, and we'll probably be so far down the line by that stage that there's not really much of an option. Then that will be a day one problem for a new Secretary of State who has to deal with a situation where there's an expansion promised, but it may not be on track. And I think it's really difficult at this distance, Rob, as it is actually for any opposition party, to work out exactly what it will do when it doesn't have all the information at its disposal, and it obviously doesn't have the civil service machine at its back to enable it to put forward alternative proposals.
But you have mentioned on a number of occasions you obviously want to provide the highest possible quality of childcare. I mean, that is what every parent is going to demand from a government if they're providing this level of childcare. I mean, how do you ensure, when you're expanding a scheme so quickly, that you can improve the quality of what's already there, but also get the high quality that parents are going to demand?
I think that was one of the critiques of the rapid expansion, Rob, that some of those quality issues had not been given sufficient attention, that this was all about the expansion of the entitlement, so there would be more hours available and there'd be more places, rather than consideration given in parallel to quality. Now, we're in an area where there's a lot of evidence, as you know, and you've been gathering some helpfully here at the Commission. There's some disagreement. Not all evidence in an area of social policy necessarily lines up, but I think there's absolute consensus on the quality point, that everyone who's looked at this issue knows that high quality is the best guarantee of children's success in an early year setting. And by high quality, we mean well-qualified staff, we mean a curriculum that's appropriate for the children at their age and stage. And we also need the conditions, the environment in which children are being educated or cared for to be of the best quality. So high quality is not something that you can just wish out of the air. You've got to think at the same time about the quality of the workforce and what that means for their training and development as well as their recruitment. And you've also got to think about the measures in place to assure and to regulate quality. Now, we've got some of that in place. Clearly, Ofsted has a role in the inspection of early years provision. That's important. But I think there's more that can be done on that front when it comes to the quality of staff and making sure the right staff are in place to provide that best provide the best outcomes for children.
One of the issues at the moment is, I think I'm right in saying 1 in 5 childcare workers have no qualifications whatsoever. Do you see a future in which every childcare worker has to have some form of qualifications?
I think that's an interesting question, because it's always this balance and dilemma when you're trying to introduce new policy, that what you don't want to do is to destabilise the system at the same time. I certainly, and this is not prejudging anything that I might say to the Labour Party, I think that we know from the evidence that the quality and the training of the workforce is a crucial factor in children's success. So I think there should be a medium to longer term aspiration to ensure that everyone who is working with young children, a highly skilled profession, has qualifications appropriate to the role that they occupy. I don't think that's a particularly contestable issue. I think the question is, how do you get there and what do you do? And I think coming back to where we are with the government's current policy, maybe there's a lesson there to try to think carefully about the implementation path, because it's very easy, isn't it, sitting in central government to pronounce that something is going to happen. But actually, you do need to think through all the steps along the way to make sure that is going to happen. So some of this could be, for example, about changing the qualifications framework, the sorts of qualifications that people can acquire. It might involve introducing new qualifications for people at different stages. It might also involve getting rid of some qualifications that are not appropriate. So there's, I think, an important piece of work to be done to have a look at the qualifications that people hold in early years and ask whether those are the most appropriate ones.
And will that be part of the work that you're going to do in preparation for a potentially incoming government?
I think if you're looking at quality, Rob, you're necessarily looking at the qualifications framework for those who are working in early years. Now, I think just coming back to what I'm doing at the moment, you know better than I do the sound and fury of election campaigns and manifesto commitments and all of that. So I think realistically, anything I say to the Labour Party or advise the Labour Party on this side of an election will be inevitably modest because of the timescale that we're in. That's not a problem, because that's what elections are like, and arguments about all kinds of different things about policy proposals. I think my eye is as much as anything towards the medium to the longer term, and trying to think about that framework for early years in childcare. And go back to where you started this, Rob. There is a desire and I think a requirement to improve quality, not to condemn what we've done up till now, but I think the next stage of the development of early years in childcare is that far, far greater emphasis on quality. And maybe that is the task of an incoming government. Yes, to think about entitlement, to think about the provision that's made, to think about hot spots or cold spots, but this is also fundamentally about quality, because of that close and deep connection between the quality of the workforce and the quality of the outcomes for children.
I'm really pleased that you've brought us back to quality, because there seems to be a lot of mixed evidence on the types of benefits and the level of benefit that early years childcare provides to different groups of children, for example. And as I've said to you before, I'm particularly interested in the sort of cognitive development as an outcome, because that seems to be the way to get the best start for children from childcare. I mean, what's your view on the evidence for the benefits and the drawbacks of universal childcare? Do you see that there are any drawbacks?
I think this is all about the choice that parents have. So if parents choose to put their child into a childcare setting, or perhaps slightly older into a nursery class or a nursery setting, they are absolutely concerned about the quality of their child's intellectual or cognitive development. Of course, that's what they want. I think you're right. There is contested and contestable evidence about the benefits, and the balance to be struck between what children are encouraged to do at home and what they're encouraged to do in a setting. I think there is quite a degree of consensus that children from more deprived backgrounds or disadvantaged backgrounds can benefit from an external setting away from the home that helps them in parallel with what's going on at home. And I think I would want to draw all of this right back to the point about poverty. We have to understand that for many parents, it's not easy. It's not straightforward. The time, the energy, the demands on their lives make it difficult sometimes to just focus that attention on their child or children. And that's where I think there's a nice complementarity between what happens in the home and what happens outside. And I think most parents are wise enough to make that judgment for themselves about the appropriate balance between what goes on at home and what goes on in an external setting. I think if you're expanding childcare, one great advantage of that is you are giving parents that greater choice if they want to shift the balance between what they're doing at home and what their child might be doing in an early years or childcare setting.
So, a Civitas report last week found that there was no long-term positive impact of early years childcare if you did it before the age of 3. And a Sutton Trust report also found that the impact of early years is very mixed for very different socioeconomic groups, and it's something you were sort of referring to a few moments ago. I just wonder whether you've considered the impact on different socioeconomic groups and that period before the age of 3 in terms of whether it's really the right thing. And you talk about choice, because at the moment the choice is very much one way. The push is very much towards giving parents the choice to work, particularly women. But the choice to stay at home is also something that a government could support and used to support if it chose to. I wonder whether you've considered those as options.
I think it's fair to say, Rob, that not everyone has the same level of choice. And I think it's entirely reasonable for government to expand the childcare and early years provision to enhance that choice available to parents. That is not in any sense, it seems to me, and I don't think there's been successive governments have had any intention of trying to undermine the question of parents who choose to be at home with their children for a longer period of time. Now, there's a different argument, obviously, about whether the state should be supporting that beyond the way it currently supports that. But I think for many children and for many parents, having that nice mix between the home and the external setting is the right one. Yes, well, I am very interested in the impact on different socio-economic groups because we do know that some of that evidence that you refer to and other evidence does suggest that there is greater benefit for children from less advantaged backgrounds to have that external support or external education and childcare in parallel to what's happening at home. Now, I think we're back to this question of the different policy objectives, and one might even say contradictory. I think they're complementary. I think you can have a situation where you've got economic benefits for the nation in expanding childcare, and you also have benefits for the child. I don't think it's a great point of contention that some children will benefit more from childcare and early years setting than others. So, for example, if you're a child being brought up in a very advantaged background and you've got lots of opportunities available to you, in many ways the complementarity of the support that you're getting for early years and childcare setting is not quite as dramatic as it might be if you're in a much less advantaged background and you don't have those kinds of opportunities. I think there's one thing we haven't touched on here, Rob, which I think is really important, and that is the impact of the COVID pandemic and what that might have done to the socialisation as well as the intellectual development of children. And I think we'll arguably not really know what the long-term impact of that is. We do know that people in early years in childcare settings, and indeed in primary schools, are talking about many children coming in not quite at the stage of development we might have wanted them to be. So although this was not an overt intention of the expansion of early years in childcare, maybe this is the moment where that kind of complementary support to what's going on at home has never been more important.
I mean, you do make a very good point about the impact of COVID, and we're all sort of with bated breath waiting to see how that unfolds, because it's clearly having a big impact on education, particularly in schools at the moment. But I'd just like to go back to talking about the children from the most deprived backgrounds, because as you're right to say, there is evidence that those children benefit disproportionately, but it also does point to the fact that other children who go into childcare, the policy that's currently being developed and seems to be growing over a period of years, it's failed to benefit the majority of participating children, because they're not coming out with any particular benefit having been through that process, it seems. In general terms, I mean, not every child is different, obviously.
I think what I would say about that is that parents are usually wise enough themselves to make a judgment about what's in the best interests of their child or children. Now, you might say, well, why is the state subsidising that kind of opportunity? And here I think you've got both the economic benefits and you've got other benefits. And I think there is some contradictory evidence on the benefits for children, particularly when it comes to the start that they are making in primary school if they've had a previous early years or childcare experience. So I don't think this is absolutely straightforward about the benefits or disbenefits of children being in that setting. I think the other thing that we know when you're referring to different social groups, one of the things that I'm quite interested in looking at is the so-called childcares or early years deserts. In other words, what parts of the country are better provided for and what parts of the country are less provided for. And some of the initial analysis suggests that there is an unhappy coincidence between areas of deprivation and the so-called childcare or early years deserts. And if we have a strong consensus that the impact on children from more disadvantaged backgrounds is greater through early years and childcare, then I think it should be an important priority to see whether we can address that question. And one of the areas, because it's been made public, that we're considering and looking at is whether an expansion of nursery classes attached to primary schools or nursery education might be a possibility, particularly as school rules are dropping over the period of time and there might be surplus place looked at. Now, that I think would be something I would want to look at, but I'd also look at it through the lens of the childcare early years deserts and see whether there might be an opportunity to expand some of that provision so that more children, particularly from disadvantaged backgrounds, can benefit from it.
I mean, that's very encouraging to hear you talking about the geographical spread of opportunity, because that's something if you've seen our State of the Nation report, that's something we've looked at very closely, and it's something I probably will come back to in a few moments. But in terms of this programme at the moment, it's quite an expensive thing to do, childcare, and it's the government is obviously prioritising, the current government and potentially a future government is going to prioritise a big chunk of money to try and do this. But isn't there a better way to target the most deprived communities, the most deprived children, the ones who would really benefit from this with that money, rather than spread it thinly across a wider range.
To use a bit of ghastly jargon, Rob, I'm a great advocate of progressive universalism. So let me just explain that before people wonder, what is that man talking about? I think in simple terms, that's the concept that you are better to broaden the reach of a social policy initiative like early years and childcare, whilst at the same time having some degree of targeting to those that might benefit most from it. The underpinning principle being that you don't want to, as it were, stigmatise those who might be the simple beneficiaries of this. And actually, the more that we feel a collective engagement in a social policy development, the better it is. So in other words, you expand early years and childcare because it actually has got benefits for everyone, but you also ensure within that policy you are targeting as much as you can to those that you think are more disadvantaged and or would benefit most. The alternative, of course, and it's an entirely legitimate policy position to have, is to say, no, we are far better to use the resource that we have and target that narrowly to those that we think would benefit most from it. I think that's just perhaps a different worldview, and it's a question of values. Do you think it is better to go for that more universalist approach with a degree of targeting in it, or do you think actually it's a better use of resource to go for the targeting and then use your money elsewhere? I think that's a legitimate and an interesting policy discussion.
And so, a couple of times in the podcast, you've referred to parents and what they want, and and they can make decisions for themselves about some of these issues. Let me just give you some of the evidence in terms of when researchers have asked parents what they want, and see what reaction I get from you. So Civitas put this to parents as a statement: if I could afford to give up my work, I would prefer to stay at home and look after my children. Now, to that statement, 37% strongly agreed or agreed with the statement. And in contrast, non-working mothers of children aged to 4, 54% either strongly agree or agreed with this statement: if I could arrange good quality childcare which was convenient, reliable and affordable, I would prefer to go out to work. So there is quite a sort of split in what parents think, and it's quite an even split. There's a lot of parents that would like to stay at home, but there are also a lot of parents that would like to go out to work. So how do you sort of marry these two things? I mean, what possible alternative options can you consider that would allow more parents to take that choice to stay at home? I mean, we've been looking, for example, in the Commission at things like tax allowances and swapping tax allowances, and whether there are other things like shared parental leave or nursery, all sorts of things we're considering. And I just wonder whether that's something that you're interested in, that's something that is going to be part of what you're doing. Where are you on that?
There's a phrase, stay in your lane, and I suppose I need to stay in my lane when it comes to the specific issues that the Labour Party has asked me to look at. And I think we're now straying into wider tax policy, Rob, and it really genuinely is not my brief to do that. I don't think it would be appropriate for me to comment on it. What I would say about the Civitas evidence, I actually think it reinforces that concept of choice that we've been talking about, because it's always easy, or it's easier, isn't it, to answer a hypothetical question about what I might do if the circumstances were different. But I think what this points to, and as you say, a relatively even split of opinion, that parents have got different aspirations. And I actually do think, and I think very strongly, those aspirations change over time. So what you might want to do when your child is younger might be quite different to what you want to do when your child is 2.5, which again might be very different to what you might want to do when your child is entering primary school. And I think that's quite an important consideration in all of this, that people's aspirations for themselves and for their children will change over time. So somebody who might want to spend a bit more time with a child at home might then actually think, well, at a point where I'm comfortable and I think my child is comfortable, I'd like them to go on into an external setting. And again, back to the point about the expansion, surely the expansion of entitlement does expand that range of opportunities at different points in both the parent's life and the child's life.
Can I go back on something we discussed a little bit earlier, that I just, because the geographical deserts you mentioned, you said they tended to be in areas of deprivation. I mean, do they tend to be in certain parts of the country particularly? Do you find that the southeast is not immune to it, but much less affected by it? What's the sort of outline?
That is broadly true, and you perhaps won't be surprised to know as well that it tends to be more the case in an inner urban area that there will be quite a lot of childcare or early years provision, almost irrespective of where it is in the country. But it's areas that might be slightly further out from the core urban areas. So you've got a combination of, yes, that rather traditional, not quite north-south, but you've got greater clusters in the southeast. But you've also got clusters of early years and childcare in inner urban areas. And that's partly because the state provision will often be greater in those areas because of money that might have gone in. And also the private and voluntary sector will often be clustered in areas of larger populations. So it's often areas that are maybe out of the urban centres that have a lower population density where you've got some of those. And actually, if you overlay on that some of the socioeconomic data, you do see some of those cold spots or hot spots, depends how you define them, emerging. And I think that is a matter of interest. And go back to, the underpinning approach that the Labour Party wants to take about opportunity. If you can break down barriers to opportunity, and we although we might not necessarily agree in every aspect of this, but we do, I think, agree that there is a value for children from less advantaged backgrounds of getting really good quality childcare or early education, then I think there's a great opportunity when it comes to those areas. So that will be something that I think will be interesting. This is not something that I'd imagine, that again, in an incoming government and day one can sort out. But if you're trying to look into the medium to longer term, and let's say the economic circumstances of the country change, and you're thinking about the choices that you might make, that's a legitimate possibility.
I'd like to just move on to, because I think we're probably coming towards the end of the broad podcast, and it's been riveting. I can tell you, it's been really interesting discussion from my point of view, anyway. I'd like to talk about things you've worked on previously, because you've obviously had a very rich and interesting career in education. And I mean, we were talking about some of the social mobility things you've done at Sunderland University.
Yes, well, we were very fortunate, Rob, to be one of the new publicly funded medical schools that was opened. And we opened in 2019. And our first graduates, indeed, will be graduating this summer. But one of the requirements, which we were entirely comfortable to sign up to, was to open up or widen access to medical education, because it does tend to be quite a narrow social strata of people who enter medical school. We're very fortunate that in the first 5 years in being, well over a third of our students are coming from widening participation backgrounds. And that is miles ahead of most medical schools. Now, we've made a particular, it's been a particular policy focus of ours to get out into the schools and colleges where we know there are incredibly talented young people there, but they might not have always thought of going to medical school. We've brought them in and we've run summer schools. We've done all sorts of things that many more advantaged students might just take for granted. And of course, we know that a family connection to medicine is often quite a driver of whether you end up yourself in the medical profession. A lot of our students have no such connections, so we're trying to make sure that we're compensating for that disadvantage. So we're doing that, and I think another quite important social mobility outcome is we're taking quite a high percentage of our students from the northeast, because again, the percentage of students going into medical education from the northeast historically has been a scandal, scandalously low. And we know that if we can keep more of those doctors in the northeast, they will help to improve health outcomes, which we both know is absolutely central to improving people's life chances. So it's been a very exciting journey to be on with the medical school, and I think it sits very consistently with what we are trying to do at the university as a whole.
I mean, that's a really good example of what works well in social mobility terms. I mean, obviously, in your varied and long career in education, are there any other sort of things within that? And it doesn't have to be university; it could be schools, whatever, where you think, you know, this policy or this idea has worked really well and should get a greater hearing, maybe?
It's a really great question, Rob, and the very fact that you are the Deputy Chair of the Social Mobility Commission demonstrates that collectively we haven't cracked this yet. We haven't cracked this, but there continues to be a focus. I look at pinch points in the education system. So I'll give you an example. The pinch point of the transition from primary education to secondary education is often one of those areas where children who might have been doing well in primary school don't quite make that effective transition into secondary school, and then that has a detrimental effect on their forward life chances. And some of the best work I've seen over the years has been really to manage that transition. Another transition is the point where students are thinking about subject choices to make at secondary school. And I can tie this back to the medical school example. A lot of students didn't realise that there were certain subjects they had to have in their portfolio at GCSE and A-level if they were even going to be considered for a medical degree. And because some of those students didn't understand that, historically, the medical school opportunity was closed down. So the quality of careers advice and guidance, whether it's about an apprenticeship, about whether it's going to further education college, whether it's going to university, that's a critical moment when it comes to social mobility and giving the right information at the right time. So I think it's look at those pinch points in the education system. And if I look into the university example, why are some of our students from the least advantaged backgrounds dropping out at the end of first year? And we've spent a lot of time looking at that and trying to understand what we can do to support. So maybe there's something about pinch points in addressing social mobility challenges.
Well, I think we've come to the end of our time, and I mean, we've covered a lot of ground, firstly. I think you've been very clear with your answers, very compelling answers, so thank you for that. Good luck with your review for the Labour Party. We're obviously going to follow it closely because we're really interested, as I think our listeners will be, about what recommendations come out of that. So thank you for your time today, and we wish you well with the review.
Thank you very much, Rob.
Please join us for further episodes of Social Mobility Talks podcast, where we'll be discussing a huge range of social mobility topics. Make sure to subscribe to Spotify, Apple Podcasts or YouTube so that you never miss an episode.